losing your family, particularly your children, being imprisoned, beaten, tortured, and ending up in a country that you don't know anything about. Now, these are some of the things that are appalling, even if they happen to any individual in isolation, meaning if any one of these happen to anyone, it is appalling. Dr. Afia Siddiqui, on the other hand, is enduring all of these simultaneously, alone. And that is what we want to talk about today, because we have to talk about it. Now, with me today is Clive Stafford Smith, who is her lawyer trying to get her out, and he has helped so many other people out of their ordeal. And some of the stories, it's difficult to have a human heart and not to cry about them. It's literally impossible. And I have gone through a number of them, and it's just unbelievable. Today, Dr. Afia Siddiqui is that story that we are going to talk about, why that happened, what is happening at the moment, and certainly, most importantly, what does future hold for her? And whatever future holds for her, well, that is the exactly same thing. It is true for the entire nation of Pakistan, because everyone is aggrieved, everyone is hurt. Clive Stafford Smith, I do welcome you on the show, and do thank you for giving us your precious time. I know you are doing so many things, so it really is. It means a lot for us.
No, look, thank you very much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. Right, we know the background, and there are some of the things that are published in the media that may or may not be true. But the benefit of having you on board is that you can confirm many of those stories. For example, she was. Even when you talk about it, it sounds very Hollywoodish, that a lone female, fragile, she's able to snatch a gun from highly trained US military personnel and then threaten his life and so forth. So those sort of stories that people use a lot to justify what happened to her. I mean, no sane mind can certainly justify that. But we will be taking
let's agree that just didn't happen. I speak as an American, and I say that the probability that my government's version of the events is true is zero. But there's a much broader story here, which I'm sure is what we need to touch on.
And building on that, you are a professional lawyer. I have a legal background. I have done my law degree from the UK. I have been teaching and training the BPTC students, help them on their way to become barristers. I've taught law in the UK at universities. We know that there is a prevailing sense in the Western sphere that it's not just a theoretical statement that you have to presume people innocent until they're proven guilty. So, it is something that is live, it's dynamic. The spirit of that you can see in the courts. But when you have a case where you accuse someone to have snatched the gun and threatened the life of military personnel, and you don't even find the fingerprints of the accused on the what happens to that innocent
let's go back much earlier. I've had this conversation with many people in Guantanamo Bay, and when I go into Guantanamo, the first thing I say as an American is, look, let me apologize to you for what we're doing, because this is the only apology you'll get from the United States, I'm afraid. But the second thing I say is, look, the real issue here is not what the US says that you did. The real issue is what the US did to you. And so when you talk about the presumption of innocence, let's talk about who we need to presume innocent to begin with. They're the ones who really should be on trial. And that, I'm afraid, is the UK government. I mean, the US government. So let's go back to the very beginning, because you can't look at any case in isolation. One thing I've learned by doing death penalty cases for 39 years now is that the biggest story is how people ended up where they ended up. And the key with Afia is we have to go back to 2003, where it confounded me to begin with when I got to Guantanamo 20 years ago that I was unable to find many people who had anything to do with terrorism. And it wasn't until I worked out that we, the US government, were paying large sums of money in bounties that I began to understand why we were making so many mistakes. Now, with Afia, we did apparently pay $55,000. This is a fact that we've got to pin down, but that seems to be the truth. But there's something very different in her case too, which is extraordinary, actually, which is why people came to think of her as having links to Al-Qaeda. And I've recently cracked this, and actually I'm very pleased, and I'm going to speak to some other witnesses to get some information in the next few days about why people got all this total misinformation about Afia. And it's because of this, and it's extraordinary. You'll forgive me if I say, Qaiser, that I think Pakistan is a fairly chauvinist country. And there are certain attitudes towards women that I'm sure none of us share among many people. And when a number of people were being interrogated, and they were being tortured and abused, so you have to have some understanding for them, they were shown books of photographs of suspected terrorists. And very often, including one individual I talked to directly recently, they didn't know any of these people. They didn't know Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and all the rest of it. So they had to say something, though, otherwise they were going to carry on being abused. And so this one person told me, well, there was this picture of a woman in there. I didn't know who she was, but I made up stories about her on the assumption that no one would do anything to the woman, which is obviously a very bad assumption. And that woman turns out to have been Afia. So much of the nonsense, the drivel that is out there about Afia is the fruit of the abuse of other prisoners who then were making up stories about her just to stop their torture. And this is one of the unique things about Afia. The other massively unique thing, which is really the key to everything in her situation, is this. Qaiser, do you have kids?
I do.
You do. How many have you got? Two. And I've got one. I'm a father of one child. None of the cases I know of in the last 20-some years of men have the men been abducted with their children. Sometimes children have been used against the fathers, but very rarely. With Afia, she was with her three children, Ahmed, who was 5, Mariam, who was 3, and Suleiman, who was just a few months old. And they were abducted with her. Now, one thing we've got to bottom out, but from what I understand, there was probably unintentional, but someone dropped Suleiman. And Suleiman, her youngest child, is killed, probably. We don't know for sure because no one's had the decency to admit it and to give closure to the family. But that's the first thing. You've got to imagine yourself as the parent with one of your children killed in front of you and what that would do to you. The second thing, which is absolutely beyond my comprehension, is that my country, I apologize, the US, took Mariam, the second child, who was just 3 years old, and forcibly fostered her into an American family for 5 years. She comes out of that when she's dumped on the streets of Pakistan, speaking English with an American accent and so forth. That's the second thing that we as parents just cannot fathom that happening to our child. And then also Ahmed, 5 years old, was held until he was 10 in similar circumstances. So, the unique aspect of this is you're a mother and your 3 children, one's been killed, apparently, 2 have been kidnapped and taken off someplace for 5 years. And you've just got to imagine, before you even get to the fact that Afia is then rendered to Bagram Air Force Base and tortured herself with the screams of the ghost woman of Bagram echoing among my other Guantanamo clients, you've just got to imagine what that does to poor Afia. And frankly, long before we get to the total nonsense that the US presented against her in the Southern District of New York, there'd have to be an awful lot to justify a presumption of innocence to the United States at this point, because what they've done is a sin against all norms of society.
It absolutely is. And as shocking, to be honest, I mean, while listening to you, I had to This is what I was talking about earlier, that going through these stories, that it's impossible to have a human heart and not get affected. But Clive, I want to keep one thing, before it becomes. Oh.
It's impossible to keep a microphone, Qaiser, as well, and when you get upset.
So sorry about that. So sorry about that.
No problem.
Oh, as emotional as it is, but I want to highlight a legal aspect here. The information you've been able to crack, that the information, it's not even information, I would say disinformation given about Afia, the disinformation required through the means of torture. Can we confirm that in the court of law, you cannot use information which is acquired through the means of torture? Is that the case?
Well, of course that's the case. I mean, you can't use involuntary statements. So in fact, under American law, if I was to offer you a Mars bar for you to change your story, that would make your story involuntary and it would be inadmissible. And there's a
Exactly.
one of the very telling things about this is that Afia was in US custody being tortured for 5 years. None of that evidence comes out at her trial in New York. She's not charged with terrorism. She's not charged with being an Al-Qaeda or anything. And that's a reflection of the fact that the US prosecutors knew that there was no admissible evidence against her on those allegations. So, yeah, you're right. But I think the proof of the pudding is that, that the US didn't even try and use that material against her.
That is shocking, but does that give us some hope? And I know that you have written about it, that you think that a sort of a review or a retrial may not be as fruitful because it's not about justice, it's not about misapplication of law or something. It's just America can do it, therefore it does that to people. But if we are to go for a retrial on the basis that we've got new information, that everything that she had to go through was based on information which was, it was an involuntary information, could that help her get out of prison?
You see, your problem is this. The US prosecutors were typically canny, and they only charged her with the allegation of attempted murder of a federal official. And this is the thing that you alluded to at the beginning, which is, according to the US, she's in custody in Afghanistan, because after she was dumped in Pakistan in 2008, this poor woman is totally traumatized. She knows Pakistan authorities, the military authorities from 2003 were behind a bunch of this. So she flees Pakistan to Afghanistan, and she gets picked up there on a bogus allegation that she's involved in something in Ghazni. So she's in American custody. The first thing the US says is that she's not handcuffed. That's nonsense. I mean, I have dealt with hundreds of prisoners over the last 20 years. And it never happens. There's no way she would have not been in handcuffs. The second thing is that the US says that a soldier puts his M16 rifle down on the floor near her. I mean, the idea of that happening with a trained American soldier is just, you got to believe in Father Christmas to believe that. And then supposedly she reaches for it. There's no evidence whatsoever that she picked up a gun and shot at anyone. The one thing we know for sure is that she was shot. So here we have an allegation that she was, she was trying to kill a federal officer, and the only person who actually got injured was her. That's the case. That's the only legal case we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the 5 years of torture before that. So that's how the Southern District of New York, if you go, I would so much rather Afia was in Guantanamo Bay, because she's had what passes for a trial in New York. In the Southern District of New York, there's a 99.5% probability that you're going to get convicted. So only one person in 200 gets acquitted. So you may as well not have a trial, really. But once you've had that trial, the legal system kicks in, and here's something for you to explain to your students, Qaiser, if you can. A case called Herrera versus Collins, the US Supreme Court held that the mere fact that you're innocent is not a reason that you shouldn't spend the rest of your life in prison or that you should be executed. Now, would you care to explain that to the assembled audience? I think you've answered. You started laughing. It's silly, right?
Oh, look, if somebody told me, after sharing this statement with me, and alter somewhat, i.e., removing the American Supreme Court and saying that this is one of the Nazis' court said in 1940s, 1942 or 1941, for example, I would have believed that straight away. Yep, that is what is expected of fascist people. But if we are to replace those facts with the actual, that information of that fictitious information of this being Nazi court and put the real information, then it's still fascist. It's still
it's shocking. But before we get pious about the Americans, the same is really true in Britain. In Britain, you can't, once you've been convicted, you can't go to the Court of Appeals claiming you're innocent. You have no right to go there at all. You have to go through the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which is the most useless body in Britain. And so what we do, unfortunately, as lawyers, is that we construct this edifice to prevent people from saying that the emperor wears no clothes. We prevent people from showing just how unjust the so-called justice system is. And I'm afraid that's what Afia faces, which is why the court of public opinion, you folk in your podcast, the media, are much more important than the US Supreme Court. And, we'll use the legal system. There's lots of things we can do to mess with them. But in the end, Afia will get released because we're able to, persuade, shall we say, politely, the powers that be to give her a fair shake and to repatriate her to Pakistan.
Sure. One thing you mentioned about the Britain not being much different, and I'd like to take a legal view on that. Let me share two pieces of information with you, actually to the audience, but through you because I'm talking to yourself. One of the reasons Guantanamo Bay being the place where all this torture and everything happens is because it's inconceivable to exact that level of torture on American soil. So instead of saying that, well, you know what, let's not torture people. Oh no, we've got a better alternative. Let's not torture people on the American soil. So somehow it will become more acceptable because it's not happening on the American soil. So that's one piece of information. Then we move to the UK, and we know that so many families have been able to claim compensation for the war on Iraq, and MOD, the Ministry of Defense of the UK, they did have to pay that money. But there's a little technicality there. They had to pay that money because of a procedural error, and that was that they did not claim derogation when it comes to the human rights. If they had claimed derogation, then there would not have been any compensation for anyone. There would not have been any case on the basis of human rights. So what we are saying is that the MOD did not say that, yes, we violated human rights, and many of the rights of the British soldiers were violated there. There is the compensation, and this is our way of saying sorry because of the violations. No, what they were saying is that because we made an error, we forgot to claim derogation, therefore we are forced to pay the money. But that's because of a legal discrepancy, not because of we accept that the human rights violations took place. Because if you had claimed derogation, then you wouldn't have been able to do that. Now, with these two pieces of information together, where are we left with all these heroic claims of creating and maintaining justice in the world and fighting the war against terrorism and all the beautiful things that we get? We know that they don't hold any value, but from your legal viewpoint, what do you make of this? Do the torture, not American soil, pay the compensation because you made an error?
Qaiser, I think it's a bit worse than you're saying, actually. I've represented a large number of those people that you're talking about. And so never in all the cases I've been involved in has the UK government admitted any sort of liability. They've all, we've shamed them in the media. We've made them look dreadful. And largely, just as the US doesn't like to do torture on its own soil, so the UK doesn't like to be seen to do torture at all. So they actually take one step removed. Let me give you the example of Binyam Mohammed. Binyam's one of my favorite clients, lovely guy, a British guy. Originally, his family was from Ethiopia. And Binyam was supposedly, this is just one of the ridiculous things in all of this, he was supposedly behind a nuclear bomb plot, if you believe it, to blow up a dirty nuclear bomb in downtown Manhattan. And the way that the US government got to this, with the complicity of the British, was they were torturing him and they were asking him what he knew about nuclear weapons. And Binyam, you know, he's a pretty obstinate guy. He told them to, you know, sod off effectively. And so they tortured him some more. And they said, you know, what do you know about nuclear weapons? And he finally said, well, I once saw something about how to make a nuclear bomb. What you do is you take uranium and you put it in a bucket and you swing it around your head for 45 minutes. That's called a centrifuge. And that divides uranium-235 from uranium-239. Bob's your uncle. There's your nuclear uranium. And this was the basis. The Attorney General of the US, John Ashcroft, interrupted his visit to Moscow to say that we've just solved a nuclear bomb plot by a guy called Benjamin Mohammed. He couldn't even get the name right. And this terrified the whole of America, right? And it was utter nonsense. And they wanted to give Binyam the death penalty. And I was representing him. And we gradually traced it back to how the US had outsourced their torture to Morocco. And in Morocco, they had taken a razor blade to Binyam's genitals every 2 weeks for a year and a half. Then they took him to the dark prison in Afghanistan, where they had outsourced it to the Afghans, where they played loud music at him 24 hours a day and tortured him in other ways. And of course, Binyam would tell them all sorts of nonsense just to try and get them to stop it. But as we looked into it, not only was the US outsourcing their torture, but the British were too. And the questions that the Moroccans were asking of Binyam in Morocco obviously came from London because they were about his home and the people he knew in school and things like that. So we sued the British. It caused a massive, massive furore in Britain because then David Miliband was the foreign secretary and he was refusing to reveal the torture that he knew the Americans had done. Now, I knew it all because I got a security clearance in America, so I'd seen it all. And it's some advantage, even though you can't reveal that stuff that's secret, it's an advantage to know what questions to ask. And so the British government, you know, they had to concede. In the end, they had to pay Binyam a substantial amount. But they never admitted liability. And they never will admit liability. And there's only one case in all of my life that I've managed with my colleagues to get the British government to say sorry. And that was where one of our clients said, I don't want your money. I just want you to stand up in Parliament and say sorry for what you did. And we did force them to do that. But it's really hard. And as a consequence, you know, the world doesn't know the secret stuff that goes on out there. And as a result, if Donald Trump gets reelected, he's going to go back to doing it, obviously.
So we have very little window there. Now, you've written an article in Dawn, as one of the Pakistani newspapers. And, you know, this is, it's very hard to go through this, the things that are mentioned there. But I will have to read that. I'll have to, you know, it's one of the difficult things to do, but here we are. That's what we do for a living, I guess. And I quote, "There is little doubt about violence that has been done to her," meaning Afia Siddiqui. "The US admits that she was shot when she was already in custody. She's been repeatedly beaten, and she lost all her top front teeth when she was kicked in the face in one such incident." How do we reconcile all that with the American conscience, with the sense of prevailing justice, which we know there is nothing beyond polemics? We all know that, but at least it's deserved to be talked about because over 1 million people have lost their lives in Iraq. All the people who've been killed in Afghanistan, according to the United Nations, 45% of whom were children. People like Afia Siddiqui, and thanks to people like yourself that we actually become aware of what is happening. meaning that there are a number of other stories, probably a lot more than these. People who've been shot in dark alleys, people who've been shot in whilst they were sleeping, or people that we never hear about. It's all there. We know that it's there. We may not be able to pinpoint them, but we know they're there. Beating a woman, and also further down, again, I quote you, that she is unique insofar as seems to have been the only woman in CIA rendition to torture program. As appalling as the rendition to torture program is, but then having a woman in there, getting beaten, losing her teeth, that's physical. And we're not talking about just psychological trauma or psychological, we are talking about being beaten, for goodness sake. I mean, how do I put it? I mean, I'm really getting... Sorry, Clive. Well, over to yourself.
I understand your angst, and let me say this. Speaking as an American, in 2000, I had done, over 20 years of work on death penalty cases, and that was shocking enough, right? I mean, I've had to watch people die in front of me in ways that are unspeakable, and I don't view that as my trauma. It's my poor client's trauma, much more than mine. But it never occurred to me that I would be faced with this systematic torture that we've seen over the last 20 years. But I want you to think about it from another perspective too. One thing that actually I'm really pleased about is we've made lots of mistakes over history. Pakistan is making lots of mistakes today. Let's face it, countries do that. Britain is too. If you think about the historical parallels, which is, for example, the way we treated Japanese Americans in World War II, it was despicable, and we treated them like animals, and it took 40 years for it to come out and for anything to be done about it. The British have a Guantanamo Bay. It's called Belmarsh. Most British people don't know about that, and they do nothing about it. And we treat people just as badly there as people have been treated in Guantanamo Bay. The thing about America that's actually really good, and we need to remember this and we need to replicate it, is as an American lawyer, I have immense power. I've got a constitution behind me that allows me to protect people. And my mum told me that as an old privileged white man, which obviously is what I am, it's my duty to go around helping the people who need help. And because I have a constitution to support what I want to do, I can do that. And it's a miracle that the most powerful person on earth, George Bush, the president in 2001, wanted to do all these horrible things and lock people up forever in Guantanamo with no legal rights. And he's lost. And we've turned that around, and we've released 98% of the prisoners from Guantanamo, and we're going to release the rest shortly. So I do think what's important to focus on here is the power that all of us have to stand up to this sort of nonsense. And the only thing that is totally inexcusable, in my view, is for those of us with privilege and power not, to stand idly by and do nothing. Because you were talking about the Nazis a while ago. I'm half Jewish myself, and the reason the Nazis came for the Jews and everyone else was other people were standing by doing nothing, and we can't allow that. And I view today it's the bearded Muslim male primarily, and then the very, very rare Afia Siddiqui, who are in the situation of suffering from the prejudice. That's all it is. It's the prejudice, and it is. We've just got to stop that. That's our job.
We absolutely have to. Now, just a couple of the points, and then we will wrap up. I appreciate you're an extremely busy man, Clive.
That's all right.
You mentioned that,
and we're going. I want to make sure we do talk about. I'm going to Houston tomorrow. And I'd like to talk about that because that's with Afia's sister, and this is going to be a real step forward in Afia's case. Can I talk about that for a minute?
Well, you absolutely can. Absolutely.
Well,
yes.
This is an extraordinary thing. I've got to say, I have immense respect for Dr. Afia Siddiqui. If I ever get locked up in Guantanamo Bay myself, I want her for my sister, because she has done fabulous stuff for Afia over 20 years. And anyway, no, we finally got her a visa to go to the US. She's not been able to visit her sister for all these years. And then, you know, she's telling me that she's worried about what's going to happen, which is not surprising. Afia told me in January she didn't want her sister to come because her sister would get abducted and, you know, taken off somewhere. And, you know, when I hear that, I think, oh, well, you know, that's just paranoid. That's not going to happen. But of course, it's totally reasonable for people to fear that after everything that Afia has been through. So tomorrow, I'm going to fly from London to Dubai, which is in the wrong direction, and to meet up with Fawzia and also with Senator Mushtaq Ahmed, who's going to come with us. And then we're going to fly this ridiculously long trip, our personal contribution to climate change, I think, all the way to Houston. And, you know, we've got lots of support from people, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistan, to make sure that there's no problems. And there will be no problems. The US would not dare to do anything to Fawzia. So, you know, that's fabulous. And then with any luck, you know, we'll drive 6 hours north to Fort Worth. And I hope to goodness that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week, we'll get Fawzia in to see her sister and Senator Mushtaq Ahmed as well. And, you know, if we can do that, that's a fabulous step forward, because Afia, for the first time in years, will see someone who she knows and loves, you know. So that's exciting, and, you know, that's part of the job, really.
Imagine that moment. Imagine that moment.
I'm going to tell you about that moment when it happens. I'll let you know.
Please do. Please do. You very briefly, you alluded to the time window that we have, that if President Trump or if the Republican Party, if they were to come back, then things will become immensely difficult. So we have now, this is the window. So what can we do in this window, sitting here in Pakistan, to support the cause, be it the legal avenues or creating more and more social awareness? Anything that you can think can help the cause.
So, you know, hope is not lost if the Republicans win, because Trump, you know, he's my president, so I can say he was. So I can say, honestly, I think the guy's deranged. But at least sometimes he can do things. You never know. But the great advantage of Biden is he's a decent guy. He understands international relations. He was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And Biden, poor chap, has had great family tragedy, losing his own son. He's someone who'll empathize with Afia's situation. But with all of these things, you have to remember that Democrats are basically weak when it comes to all of these issues, because they're so terrified of being labeled soft on crime or soft on terrorism or whatever. So we have to figure out a way that we can come up with a deal that that makes Biden look good. And look, I know there's opposition to doing a swap for Shaquille Afridi or whatever, but anyone who has an opposition to that just needs to tell us what else we can do, because that's the obvious deal that we need to work out for Afia. But if someone's got a better idea, just tell me, because I don't care. I just want to get to the end result. But we need to work out who is the obstacle to that being an agreement, and then we need to persuade them that there's nothing to fear. And look, let's face it. I can say this because, you know, I honestly don't care what people think, but there are people out there, I think, who are afraid of Afia, because they're afraid that when the truth comes out about what happened in her abduction originally in Karachi in 2003, that they'll be in trouble. Well, I'm here to tell you they won't be. They're not going to be in trouble. And the reason they're not going to be in trouble is twofold. One is poor Afia is so traumatized that when we get her out, she doesn't need to be going on television or anything. She needs to be with her family in treatment so that she can recover somewhat. So no one has anything to fear from Afia. And the second thing is we're looking forward. We're not looking backwards. Much as I think sometimes that it's appropriate for people to be held responsible for the wicked things they did, honestly, it's a barrier to us solving the problem. So, you know, I'm not here to make people look bad. I'm here to get Afia home. So I just want the people who are not on our side to do some sort of agreement some negotiated arrangement with the US, to just, I'll talk to him. I'll be happy to talk to him, and we'll sort out how we can do it in a way that makes everyone happy.
Well, that'd be a result, and I think it's going to be, one of the best things that people of Pakistan will have heard in probably last 20 or so years, because an entire generation grew up learning about how many people have been killed in bomb blast in what city. And none of that had anything to do with Pakistan, but this is how last 20 years, effectively, are talking about a generation that they don't know anything else. And, after that, if we can have a news like this, that our daughter, our sister is back where she belongs, then, I concur with you that I don't think there will be, it's not very likely that there are going to be any problems, because she would want to have the treatment that she is denied for last for all these years, and she would want to have some privacy where she can explore her inner self, think about her children, because I'm not sure if you've been tortured, you can think about the lost children all the time and everything else. So I think she would relish the opportunity to be alone and be herself. I think that is
and be with her kids. Let's face it. I mean, one of the things I hope we'll be able to do in Texas next week is show her pictures of her kids, because her kids, the two kids who I've met, she should be proud of. They've done wonderful things. They've really achieved a lot, but they're still young, 23, 25. But they've done great stuff, and I think she wants to spend the time she's missed with them for the last 20 years.
Clive Stafford Smith, thank you so very much indeed. I hope that this is not just one-off infraction. I would want to spread spread knowledge as much as we can of what is happening in the Western world, and what can we do to stop it. By Western world, I don't mean the Steves and Stacys who get up at 4 a.m. in the mornings because they need to get to their workplace by 5 because they have to provide for their family. We are talking about the powerful policymakers who think they can run the world the way they want to because they can. Thank you so very much indeed, and I really, really hope to have you back for another podcast. Until that time, sir, thank you so very much indeed.
Okay, thank you for having me, and I'd love to come back again sometime.
Thank you.